But first of all, we're going to talk about, I want to make sure everyone sees this. So in New Mexico, there are a couple of things you can do to get a permit to discharge wastes. The first thing is we have a ground and surface water protection regulations. And what these regulations do, it's really interesting. They don't really prevent pollution. They allow someone to pollute. And you can get what's called a discharge permit under these regulations. And typically that permit will require abatement of the pollution you're causing down the road. So it's really interesting. It's not preventative. It allows pollution, and that's simply what it does. And we look at the whole totality of the circumstances and see how much load we're putting into the aquifer or the stream bed. In this sense, it's the aquifer because it's groundwater. So just as a footnote here, when we're talking about discharging into groundwater, that's a state jurisdictional issue. Surface water is the feds. That's why we had EPA involved, Region 6, in the NPDES permit application that the Bishops Lodge ultimately abandoned. So that's where we are. But one thing we have to know here, and it's important for you to know, that this type of permit is generally reserved for industrial facilities. It's not reserved for liquid waste disposal activities because there's an entirely different set of regulations that apply to that. And this is the liquid waste disposal regulations. And no person can discharge effluent from a liquid waste treatment unit without first getting a permit under those regulations. Now, preliminarily, let me tell you, I believe that the application is proceeding under the former and not the latter. In other words, the application is proceeding under the ground and surface water protection regulations and not the liquid waste regulations. Because if it proceeded under the appropriate regulatory body, I don't think it could be granted. And that's what we're going to pursue further. All right, as I mentioned, the liquid waste disposal regulations, they're different in their terms of their purpose than the surface and groundwater protection regulations that industrial facilities have to be permitted under. The regulations in this instance are really designed to protect human health and the environment, not to abate it once the damage occurs, but to make sure the damage does not occur. In other words, you're not authorized to pollute under this set of regulations as you are under the discharge regulations for industrial facilities. Here, it is designed to prevent degradation of the environment. All right, so, and here are the requirements. They're really quite different, and they're quite clear. If you're falling under liquid waste disposal regulations, you got some things you got to watch out for. Number one, it's got a liquid waste system is a treatment unit and disposal system, which Bishops Lodge is applying for, that serves a residential or commercial unit. Importantly, the total wastewater received by the system may not exceed 5,000 gallons per day. Now, Rusty just told you it's 30,000 gallons, right? So how do you do that? Well, what you do is you can have multiple 5,000 gallon per day disposal units, and you separate them based on siting requirements on the lot. The reason you do that, and Phoebe will explain this better than I can, but the reason you do that is you want to dilute the environmental effect. You don't want to pour everything down one leach field. You want to have a variety of leach fields at different locations to minimize the adverse environmental impacts. Does it make sense? Makes sense, right? It's very commonsensical. Another requirement, though, which is extremely important here, is the 20.7.3.201 requirement, which says that the liquid waste system has to be located on the lot which generates the waste. So what does that do for all the villas and all the residential units that Bishops Lodge has agreed to take their waste and aggregate it into one system disposing of 30,000 gallons per day? Well, it runs afoul of this particular regulation. So, what did Bishops Lodge do? And again, this is Rusty's research, it's pretty good. What did they do when they were selling the villas? Well, they said, don't worry about it. We're going to connect you to our system. And we're going to dispose of your waste, not on your lot, as per the regulations, but on our lot. So these unsuspecting buyers of all these properties thought, well, that looks good to me. I don't have to deal with it. It just goes down to the so-called sewer system and into one aggregated disposal site. And I think Eric's going to mention some involvement of the villa lot owners later on in our presentation. But that was in their plat filed in the county records. So that was the representations to the buyers of these lots, that you don't have to comply with the regulations that apply to liquid waste disposal because we're going to take your waste. It's another problem. All right, as I mentioned, so here's what the regs say. Look, if you can dispose of more than 5,000 gallons per day. And by the way, I can tell you that the Environment Department of Bishops Lodge, the first thing they're going to say is, those regulations don't apply because we're disposing of more than 5,000 gallons per day. We're disposing of 30, so we're not subject to the liquid waste regulation requirements. Well, that's a paradoxical and contradictory statement, because what that says, in essence, is that the more waste you dispose of, the less regulatory oversight you have. That doesn't make any sense. And the regulations actually discuss this, so it's not jurisdictional. You don't get to catapult out of the liquid waste regulations and into the surface and groundwater regulations because you're disposing of more than 5,000 gallons per day. It says you can have multiple systems. So there we have it. I think initially those are the first avenues of contesting this application. And each system's got to be located in the lot. The scale of each permitted system is limited to 5,000 gallons per day or less. They have to be separation from each system with the appropriate setbacks. And the purpose of this is really quite simple, because New Mexico, northern New Mexico in particular, very rural, and we had to place responsibility on the individual lot owner to make sure they weren't putting things in their system that weren't allowed by the permit. Now, as we know, we don't know what people are putting in their systems from up in the villas, because there's no mechanism of enforcement. That's not their problem. It's out of sight, out of mind, right? It could be medical waste. It could be anything. It could be turpentine. We just don't know what it is. So the idea was each permit would be enforceable against the lot owner on which the system was located. Yeah, and I think at this point, I'd like Phoebe Swain is really, she's the one to discuss the environmental effects of why this is here, this hazard prevention, and why this is necessary for the liquid waste regulations, and why it's necessary that we do this, and the policy reasons behind it. So, Phoebe, may I have you come on up and speak? Thank you so much.